You're listening to the Kingdom Project Podcast. These are discussions on biblical theology and interpretation. The emphasis is on context and grace. The goal is to promote biblical literacy by displacing and debunking most modern interpretations. The challenge is to engage in healthy conversation that may stretch but sharpen iron. This is the Kingdom Project, and I'm your host, Marcus Hall. Hey, what's going on? Thanks for listening. Welcome to a new episode in the Eschatology series, where we are going to continue to look at Matthew 24. Happy New Year, all that good stuff. We are past the 100th episode. This would be, 104, which is crazy, to say the least. 105, actually. We've had over 300 downloads. More subscribers. So awesome. Thank you so much. If you don't mind, leave a review and subscribe. But leaving a review helps with the algorithm when people are checking, doing searches or whatever. It just helps us show up in the searches. If you are new, welcome aboard. But I highly doubt you're jumping in at this point, just right here, very new. I know that there's some new listeners, and they're starting from the very beginning. So some things have changed. There's no Patreon. There's just a PayPal me little link that you can go to in the description to give money. Tax time's coming up. I know y'all going to get some taxes. You want to help me out here. I will have to pay very soon to stay on the air. I don't know. I hate asking if you would like to give. I would ask that you would give if you've benefited at all from this ministry, and you would like to help keep it going. As in paying for the hosting services and all that, you can give. Send it to PayPal, and if you don't want to do that, but you have benefited, share an episode, share the podcast Facebook page, join the group, whatever, just get the word out. So thanks so much. Anyway, besides that, I guess things are going good at church. Just doing some small talk here, trying to be personal. But everything's going well. It's a new year, and the weather, I would say, just is generally just blah around here. And too warm for my liking, in the 50s, and rainy, and I would like some snow, but I can't do anything about that. So let's just go ahead and jump into this and just get into it. Matthew 24, we have introduced this chapter in its context, okay? We've looked at the disciples' questions. Now we want to start to look at Jesus' answers that he gives to those questions, okay? So we're going to try to get through verses 4 through 14, okay? So as we start to look at Jesus' answers, we must keep in mind the disciples' question, all right? If you remember, the disciples asked Jesus, when will the temple be destroyed? When will one stone not be left upon another? They're also asking, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? All right. So when we looked at the fact last time that the disciples did not understand that Jesus was leaving, we saw that they were not asking, when will you return? And we saw the word coming in the Greek as parousia, which means presence. And it would be a manifestation of his messiahship and his appearing, coming up to the Ancient of Days, taking his seat at the right hand of God. And the small little edit there, sorry, heat was about to kick on. It wasn't on at all the whole time I was preparing. My office has the HVAC system in a closet in here, so I have to shut off the air or the heat when I record episodes, depending on the time of the year, because if it kicks on, it'll be very loud in the background. Okay, so that's why there's an edit in there. Not gonna take tons of time to make a very smooth transition edit. Don't care. Okay, so coming up to the Ancient of Days, sitting at the right hand of God, and the end of the age is referring to the end of the Jewish age, the Old Covenant, not the end of the world. All right, so you could put the disciples' question this way: hey, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of your presence in power and glory as Messiah, and the end of the Old Covenant? Okay. I'm sorry, guys. I keep hitting that. Man, so unprofessional. So we want to look with those questions, that framework, that question in mind. We're going to look at Jesus's answers now. Okay, so we go to 4. Okay, Matthew 24, 4 and 5. We'll look at that first. Okay, and Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray." All right, so who is this? See that no one leads you astray, right? Who is them? Who is you in this verse? It's the disciples. So we have to keep that in mind as we move through, just like the questions. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, all right? Audience relevance, all right? Whatever Jesus's answer means, it has to have meaning to them. So any application that we make to ourselves from Scripture should only be made after we understand what it meant to the original audience, okay? So we keep in mind the principle of audience relevance, okay? And I do belabor that point a lot, and the reason why is because most people today miss it, all right? Because there's many, a theologian, Walvard, says that as Matthew 24, 4 through 14, as events of the church age leading up to the tribulation, is what he says, that these signs indicate that the end of the age is approaching in our time. All right, so just because it's prophetic doesn't mean that it's prophetic for us. That's sort of the whole point here. Okay, so now James Stewart Russell has got a book, and I have it, and it's called the Parousia, and it's a beast, and it was written in the 1800s. It's sort of hard to understand at times. Slowly making my way in bits and pieces. I haven't read it in its entirety. But when he first released that book, he didn't even have his name attached to it in fear of being crucified, so to speak. But this is what he says on this section. He says, "It is impossible to read this section and fail to perceive its distinct reference to the period between our Lord's crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem. Every word is spoken to the disciples and to them alone. To imagine that you in this address apply not to the disciples to whom Christ was speaking, but to some unknown and yet non-existent persons in a far distant age is so preposterous a suspicion. He doesn't say suspicion. Supposition, as not to deserve serious notice. All right. So Jesus begins with a warning against expecting his immediate presence. He doesn't want them to be deceived by false Christ that would soon be appearing. He wants them to understand that he will be gone for what might seem like a long time to them, but it'll be 40 years. All right. So if we look at Luke 19, verses 12 and 13, it says, "He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return, calling 10 of his servants, and he gave them 10 minas, and said to them, engage in business until I come." So Jesus was going to leave them to receive his kingdom, and in between his departure at the ascension and his parousia, these are the things that would be happening to them. False messiahs is one. So Luke 21, the parallel in verse 8, "See that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them." Okay, so Luke adds this this phrase here, because it's not in Matthew 24, but he adds, "The time is at hand," or "the time has drawn near." So Jesus was not talking about something that would take place hundreds or thousands of years later. Jesus was warning his disciples about something that was drawing near in their time. So we have to ask, were there false messiahs that arose and deceived people in those years before 70 AD? And the answer to that is yes, because along with historical records outside of the Bible, we have biblical accounts of this too. Acts 5, verse 36, "For before these days," this weird name, Theodos, "rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him, and he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing." All right. According to Josephus in his Antiquities, 12 years after the crucifixion, this man here mentioned in Acts 5 persuaded a great multitude to follow him to the Jordan River, and he claimed he would divide this river for their passage. The land, says Josephus, was overrun with magicians, seducers, and impostors who drew the people after them in multitudes into solitudes and deserts to see the signs and miracles which they promised to show by the power of God. And also at that time, Felix, who is mentioned in Acts 23 and 25, the country of the Jews was filled with impostors who Felix put to death every day. A statement which actually indicates then their great number, right? There's an Egyptian who pretended to be a prophet that gathered 30,000 men, claiming that he would show how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down. Origen mentions a certain wonder worker, Josephus, I think, who claimed that he was Christ, foretold by Moses. And we also see another one of these false Christs in Acts 8, 9, and 10, which is Simon. And it says, "But there was a man named Simon who had previously practiced magic in the city and amazed the people of Samaria, saying that he himself was somebody great. And they all paid attention to him, from the least to the greatest, saying, 'This man is the power of God that is called great.'" Now, according to Irenaeus, Simon claimed to be the Son of God and the creator of angels. And Jerome also says that he claimed to be the Word of God, the Almighty. And Justin relates that he went to Rome and was acclaimed as a god by his magical powers. Okay. Now, if we take a look at 1 John 2:18, it says, "Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour." So now, John, writing somewhere around 65 AD, doesn't say it's the last days, but he says it's the last hour. And as Jesus has told the disciples, many false messiahs, antichrists, would come. All right, so there's examples of false messiahs that in historical records says that were a great number. And so Jesus had prophesied that there would be many. There's this guy, Griswold, has a work called On the Parables. He calls attention to the remarkable fact that while many of these false messiahs appeared in the interval between Jesus' ascension and the Jewish war, there's no evidence that any arose claiming the title before the beginning of his ministry. All right, so we have that. Now, Jesus goes on in Matthew 24:6, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." Okay, now, wars, I have to say this, wars are not a sign of the end. As the end of this verse clearly tells us, the end is not yet. He will tell them later in this chapter that when they see a war, not hear of one, that's when they are to flee. Okay? So, now we ask the question, did the disciples hear of wars and rumors of wars? The answer is yes. There were wars in the tributaries of Rome all over Palestine, Galilee, and Samaria in 66 AD, preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. When he was making this prophecy, they were actually in the Pax Romana, which was peace, and nothing. And there had been no wars. All right, so more historical records outside of the Bible, like by Tacitus. It was a Roman. He wrote history. He uses such as expressions as disturbances in Germany, commotions in Africa, commotions in Thrace, insurrections in Gaul, intrigues among the Parthians, and the war in Britain and war in Armenia. Okay, among the Jews, the times were really turbulent. There's a bunch of words here I can't say. Seleucia, 50,000 Jews were killed. There was an uprising against them in Alexandria, and there was a battle between the Jews and Syrians in Caesarea, where 20,000 were killed. Caligula ordered his statue placed in the temple at Jerusalem, and the Jews refused to do this and lived in constant fear that the emperor's armies would be sent into Palestine. This fear would become so real that some of them did not even bother to till their fields. Okay, so but though there would be wars and rumors of war, Jesus has said here, see that you're not be troubled. All right, see that you're not alarmed, for this must take place. And again, I'm stressing this point, but the end is not yet. What end is he talking about? Keep in mind their question. They want to know when the end of the Old Covenant age would come. All right? This is the end of the Jewish economy. This is pointing to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Wars and rumors of wars were not and are not signs of the end. Contrary, right, to the contrary, Jesus wanted them to know that these things were not signs of the end. None of these would be the sign which would cause the disciples to flee to the mountains. Okay, so moving on, verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Okay, so the word nation here in Greek is ethnos. It means a race. Okay. So did race rise against race? Josephus says, yeah. At Caesarea in 59, the Jews and Syrians contended about the right to the city. 20,000 Jews were killed. There's another place where over 13,000 Jews were killed. Thousands were killed in other places. Alexandria, 50,000. Damascus, 10,000 in an hour's time. And Jesus is speaking about the conflicts between Gentiles and Jews, which began to take place shortly after this time and continued to the beginning of the Jewish war. Okay, so for some time previously, Gentiles and Jews had been living for the most part in peace together, but this period would be distinguished by wars. Okay, so famines. There's a famine that's foretold by Agabus. He's prophesies it in Acts 11:28. And he says, and one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. Okay, Claudius is Caesar. This famine is mentioned by several historians, including Eusebius, and it is said to have been severe in Jerusalem. And Josephus says that many people perished for want of food. And Judea was especially hard hit by famine, and the disciples sent aid to them. In the very next verse in Acts chapter 11, verse 29, so the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. Okay, so again, in records, there's talk of a failure in the crops and a famine consequent thereupon. Eusebius mentions famines during this time in Rome, Judea, and Greece. So there were famines. And where there is famines, there is pestilence, all right? That's the spread of disease and epidemics. Famine and pestilence go hand in hand. It's pestilence most of the time is often caused by famine. And there is, again, records of pestilence at Rome in the days of Nero, which were so severe that within the space of one autumn, there died no less than 30,000 persons. And Josephus also records that pestilences raged in Babylonia, starting even in 40 AD. And there was pestilences in Italy in 65 AD. So there was both of these going on in the time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we have earthquakes. Okay, was there earthquakes? Yeah. There's mentions of earthquakes in Rome. Here's a quote: frequent earthquakes occurred by which many houses were thrown down, and 12 populous cities of Asia fell in ruins from an earthquake. Around 58 AD, there's this quote, which is pretty intense, actually, and this is by Seneca, I believe. I'm not sure. It's Seneca. These names are all hard. But it says, how often have cities of Asia and Achaia fallen with one fatal shock? How many cities have been swallowed up in Syria? How many in Macedonia? How often has Cyprus been wasted by this calamity? How often has Paphos become a ruin? News has often been brought us of the demolition of whole cities at once. This was in 58 AD. I believe historically, this was the greatest amount and most intense earthquakes ever recorded in history. It's pretty incredible. In 60 AD, there's Colossae, Laodicea. They were overthrown from earthquakes. Crete, Smyrna, Samos, Judea, everywhere there's earthquakes, okay? So in spite of what Jesus said, the end is not yet. But many will take this, wars and rumors of wars and the rest of it, take it out of context and speak about it as the signs of the times, trying to show that this battle, serious earthquake and famines will be a sign of Christ's immediate return, all right? But all these things were happening prior to 70 AD in the fall of Jerusalem, all right? So they're not signs, all right? If you look back over history from that time on, when has there been a time when there were not wars, famines, pestilence, and earthquakes, right? They're not signs. Jesus said to his disciples that these are the beginning of sorrows in the next verse. All these are but the beginning of sorrows or of birth pangs. I'm going back and forth between ESV and New King James Version, so that's why I have the different phrases. Okay, so this birth pains, beginning of sorrows is birth pains. So this is an image that's used in the Old Testament over and over, simply to express great pain, but is often used as a woman in pain of childbirth, all right? In Isaiah 13:8, 26:17, Jeremiah 4:31, 6:24, Micah 4:9 and 10. It's used almost as a special term for the birth pains of Messiah, okay? And so in this passage, it speaks of the period of distress preceding the return, or the presence, the coming in wrath and judgment of Jesus on the clouds in 70 AD. Its use here seems to be chosen to denote the birth pains of what? A new world or a new covenant, all right? So did Jesus use this phrase before? Yeah. John, let me get some of these things, all these closed out here. John 16. I sort of... a little while. John 16:16. A little while, and you will not see me. And again, a little while, and you will see me, because I go to the Father. And the disciple questioned Jesus about this statement. And here's my problem here. Don't have it all pulled up. Excuse me. All right, here we go. Sorry. A little while, and you will see me no longer, and again a little while, and you will see me. So some of his disciples said to one another, What is that he says to us? And they repeat this. So they were saying, what does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. Jesus knew what they wanted to ask him. Okay, see, again, Jesus wasn't just a man in obedience with the Father. Jesus knew what they wanted to ask him. So he said to them, is this what you are asking yourself? What I meant by saying, a little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me? Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy. Okay? And then he starts to explain himself here. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for the joy that a human being has been born into the world. Okay? So the disciples would be sorrowful during the Lord's absence, but their sorrow would turn to joy. All right? And then the ideal of a woman in labor is used for the suffering that precedes this coming of the Lord in his kingdom. Okay? Micah 4, 9, and 10. Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished? That pain seized you like a woman in labor. Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon, there you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. All right, so Jesus said this is like birth pains. It's the beginning of sorrows. They weren't signs to the disciples, and they're not signs today. They did not signal the end, but stretch over the entire period from the ascension to the destruction in 70 AD. Okay, so now we go to Matthew 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Who will be delivered up and killed? The disciples. You should be getting this by now. So it is true that all Christians who live a godly life will certainly go through things, and some will, suffer varying degrees of persecution, all right? But here he is speaking to the disciples, and the disciples did experience tribulation and death. All you need to do is read the book of Acts, all right? Okay, so now look at Luke 21:12. That says, but before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my sake. All right. So Luke adds before all this, or before all these things, showing that the persecutions are to start at the beginning of this period. And the persecution of disciples they began immediately after the day of Pentecost. Okay. Mark 13:9, but be on guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. Mark adds that they'll be this beaten in synagogues, all right? And all this is fulfilled in Acts. You can see it. Peter and John were imprisoned. In the New King James Version of Acts 4:3, it says, and they laid hands on them and put them into custody until the next day, for it was already evening. All right. So ESV just says, and they arrested them and put them in custody. But, Jesus said they're going to lay hands on you. And here it says, and they laid hands on them. Paul and Silas were imprisoned. Paul was brought before, what's his name? Gallio. Felix and Agrippa. Stephen was stoned to death. James was killed by Herod. And as soon as Paul began his ministry, he was he began to experience persecution as well. Paul was beaten 5 times by the Jews. He says that from the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus the 1. So Jesus said the disciples would be afflicted, beaten, and imprisoned. They would be hated for his namesakes. Some would be killed. They would be brought before councils and rulers and kings for a testimony, and they would be given a mouth of wisdom, which their adversaries could not dispute. And they all, the disciples experience, maybe not all, they experienced all of this, though, before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, just like Jesus said that they would. All right, every fulfilled in every detail. So now we're going to go to the next one. Verse 10. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. All right. Because of the great persecution, many apostatized from the faith. Okay. And Jesus spoke on this in Matthew 13, 20 and 21. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. So in those days, many Christians were executed because of others who turned on them and turned them in. They turned them in order to spare themselves. Okay. And now Jesus goes on and says, many false prophets will arise and lead them astray. This is not the same as false messiahs, all right? But false prophets is false teachers among the believers. Most likely would have been referring to the I stumble. I get talking fast. The Judaizing opponents of Paul. And Paul spoke of them. And he says in 2 Corinthians 11 that for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. In 1 John 4:1, it says, do not believe every spirit. Test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. All right. Now, Jesus goes on in verse 12, it says, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. All right. Now, Jesus told the church at Ephesus that they had lost their first love in Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, when he says, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Now, everything that you look at or read in Josephus, that whole testimony of Josephus shows the utter lawlessness of the Jewish society in the disciples' lifetime. All right. So there's scriptural evidence and historical evidence for this. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. All right. So there's much debate about this. Some take it to mean that if they did not remain faithful to Christ to the point of death, they would not be redeemed. I don't see that. That doesn't make sense. That would make our salvation a work. So it is saying that if we don't endure, we will be lost, right? I believe the Bible very, very clearly teaches that salvation is a gift. It will not be lost to those who genuinely have faith. So I don't believe that interpretation of saying that if faithful to the point of Christ, they would not be redeemed, all right? Romans 4:5, but to him who does not work but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness, all right? So, and I could go on and on about that, but what then is he saying here? I think he's telling the believers that if they remain faithful right up to the end, they will be saved from the physical death that's happening in the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the Greek word saved is sozo. It means to save or to deliver or protect. And literally and figuratively, it can mean heal and preserve or be or make whole. All right. The Christians who did not endure but turned back to the old covenant or back to Judaism died when the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed. Those believers, though, who remained faithful, they fled to the mountains as the Lord had told them, and it would save their lives. And then in verse 14, it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." All right, now remember the disciples' question. What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And what end is he talking about here? Unless we take this verse clear out of its context, the end in view here is the end or destruction which was to come upon Jerusalem and the temple, ending the old covenant age or the Jewish age. Jerusalem would be destroyed, but first the gospel would be preached to all nations. Did this happen? All right. We have seen that everything else so far has taken place in the lifetime of the disciples. All right. But was the gospel preached in all the world before 70 AD? And that's where people say, well, that's going to be double fulfillment if, or no, that's not happened yet. Look at all these places. We've not even got there yet. All right. The common belief among believers is that once the gospel is preached to the whole world, then Christ the end of the world will happen, and then Christ comes, or however in that time frame of the futurist goes. All right, but this is pretty big in dispensational beliefs and premillennialism. All right, that it's not been done, but okay. The end that is in view in this context is the end of the old covenant, the end of Jerusalem. Okay, so the gospel had to have been preached to all the world by then, or we would have to believe that Jesus was wrong. So which would you rather live with there? All right. Now listen, we can go to scriptures and see if they gave us any insight to this matter. Okay. Remember what we saw in verse 9, that they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So why would the apostles be hated in all nations if they had not preached the gospel in all nations? They were hated by all nations because they did, in fact, preach in all nations. And Paul says this. Paul declares that the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven in Colossians 1:5-6, because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel, which has come to you, as it is also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit, as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. And then in verse 23, it says, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Okay, so in Matthew 24:14, the Greek word for preached is Kerusso, caruso. It is in the future tense, all right? But in Colossians 1:23, the same word is used in the past tense. Jesus said that it is to be preached, and Paul says in around 62 AD that it has been preached to every creature. So Paul also said that the faith of the Romans was spoken of throughout the whole world in Romans 1:8, when he says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world." And he said the gospel had been made known to all nations in Romans 16:25 and 26. But he says, "Now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery kept secret since the world began, but now has been made manifest, and by the prophetic scriptures has been made known to all nations, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, for obedience to the faith." Okay, so we know that Paul traveled through Asia Minor, Greece, and Crete. And he was in Italy. He probably was in Spain and Gaul, according to Romans 15:24 through 28. And during this time, the other apostles weren't sitting around either. They were out there, and that there is much proof that within 30 years after this prophecy that Jesus spoke, that churches were established in all regions, okay? Another name, Chrysostom, wrote, "Therefore he added, moreover, and this gospel shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all nations, and then shall the end come of the downfall of Jerusalem." He meant this, and for in proof that he meant this, and that before the taking of Jerusalem the gospel was preached, hear what Paul saith, "Their sound went into all the earth, and again the gospel which was preached to every creature which is under heaven." Okay, so and it goes on. Eusebius wrote, "Thus, under the influence of heavenly power and with the divine cooperation, the doctrine of the Savior, like the rays of the sun, quickly illumined the whole world, and straightway, in accordance with the divine scriptures, the voice of the inspired evangelists and apostles went forth through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." All right. Now, many today say that the gospel has not been preached to all the world, and that this verse in Matthew 24 has not yet been fulfilled. But the Bible says that all nations of the world heard the gospel preached before 70 AD, right? It's because of the word world. It was their known world. It was the everything that they knew of that time, the Roman Empire, pretty much, all of that. All right, to deny that Matthew 24:14 has been fulfilled is to deny the clear statements of God's word, and it's to say that Jesus was wrong and a liar. All right, but and then he said, and then the end will come. All right, so the end of what? Right? Again, what were they asking? The end of the temple, the end of the Jewish age, the old covenant. He is not saying the world will end then everyone when everyone has heard the gospel, or the Christian age will end, right? Jesus very, very clearly tells his disciples that before the temple would be destroyed, and before his parousia and the end of the old covenant age, the gospel must and would be preached in all the world. And it was. And then the temple was destroyed, and he came in his presence, and the old covenant age ended. All right. So this does not mean that the gospel was not to be preached after the end had come. It was to be preached forever and always. All right. Take a look at the parable of the wedding feast, and then after that, notice what he says to his servants after the city is destroyed. He says, "Go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding." All right. So it's ongoing. All right. I'll actually just pull that up in full detail. This is Matthew 22. the parable of the wedding feast, okay? And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry and sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. Right? And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with the guests. All right. It first goes to the Jews. They reject him. And then the city's destroyed. And then all those still following that fled this destruction would go out and proclaim the gospel to all that. So we dwell in the New Jerusalem, in the very presence of God, and the invitation is still going out today of reconciliation. And that invitation, actually, that goes forth from the new heaven and earth. If you were to just take a moment and read, let's look this one up too, because we're almost done. So let's just take the minute to do it. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 17, the Spirit and the bride say, Come, and let the one who hears come, and let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires take the water of life without price. So we dwell in this new Jerusalem with this. This invitation is going out today, and it comes out from the new heaven and earth, because the old has passed away and the new has come. All right. So we should faithfully be proclaiming this message to everyone who is thirsty. Come, you are forgiven. Now be reconciled. All right. Forgiveness and reconciliation. All right. There's a difference. There's forgiveness, and the reconciliation is regeneration, to be made new. You're forgiven. Come be made new. All right. So, there is that with Matthew 24, 4 through 14. It's a lot to go through, I know. I'm looking at probably, let's see, after this, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more episodes for Matthew 24, I would say. Just depends on how long it takes to get through the rest of that text. So, it takes quite a bit of study and research, and hopefully I'm making it easier for you guys. All right. So hopefully that has brought something to the table for you to learn and make you think. All right, guys, there's another episode of the Eschatology series is done. Questions, comments, disagreements, send them my way at thekingdomprojectpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, be a mustard seed, be leaven. Thank you for listening.